Hello everyone, and welcome to the presentation Risk is the Compass, a process approach audit model using risks and controls. I'm Mike Richmond, your host for Exemplar Global's online expo focused on career pathways. This session is presented by Dennis DeVos, an auditor, engineer, author, and fellow at ASQ. He's a well-known authority on quality management and lean methods. In this presentation, Dennis will delve into the topic of risk-based thinking as introduced in ISO 9001-2015. He'll cover why process design and execution must involve consideration of risks, and also why it's essential for QMS auditors to consider how well management controls address process risks overall. And with that, Dennis, thanks for joining us at the expo.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to Exemplar Global for inviting me to do this presentation for you today. As Mike said, I've been involved with quality management systems and auditing for about 30 years. I got my start with the 1987 version of the standard. I'm proud to have led the first ISO 9000 implementation at a General Motors plant in North America. So I started out my career at General Motors, then I became an RAB accredited auditor for several years. And right around the year 2000, I left full-time auditing and went into private practice, providing consulting and training services to industry. Of course, right around that time, ISO 9001 was revised in the year 2000, and that is where we were introduced to the process approach. And early in my practice, of course, I was greatly involved in helping clients to evolve from the 1994 version of the standard to the new ISO version 2000 with the with the process approach. And so I had to create a model to help my clients do that. And really, we're going to be talking about three key takeaways. We're going to be talking about flow charts as the basis for the process approach and as the basis for auditing. That's the approach that I used and continue to use with clients, again, when I was upgrading them from the 1994 standard to the 2000 standard. And at that time, of course, we had all read a lot of books about auditing that said you should include risk when you're doing an audit. And everyone said it, but nobody had a tool. And I loved the idea, but since I couldn't find a tool out there, I sort of had to invent my own. So this model I'm going to show you today is actually about 20 years old. It does predate risk-based thinking that came to us, 10 years ago. So three key takeaways today. I want to talk about flow charts really as the basis for process approach. And I encourage you, when you hear the word process, when you hear the word process approach or process auditing, I want you just to think about flow charts. Once we have a flow chart, then we can start to think about what risks exist in each process and what offsetting controls may be in place to mitigate those risks. And then another thing I want to talk about is inputs. There seems to be some, disconnect, misunderstanding around what inputs are. So that's the third thing I really want to sort of focus on. So we're going to talk about flow charts as the basis for QMS. We're going to be talking about risks, etc. So I work a lot in the automotive industry where we are required to audit by process. So when I teach internal audit classes, I teach them this approach, how to create a flow chart in order to prepare and plan for an audit. Now, it would be ideal if auditors did not have to create flow charts. It would be ideal if a quality management system was already based on a series of flow charts. So I'm encouraging anyone listening to this today to really think about the architecture of your own QMS ought to be based on a set of flow charts, and then each of those flow charts almost becomes an audit checklist. Since the 2015 version of the standard, this risk-based thinking, it takes the pressure off of us auditors now to audit with risk. Risk-based thinking compels us to embed risks into process design. Thank goodness now we, the auditors, again, maybe don't have to do that. It ought to be done for us. We want to design our processes to be easy to audit, and we really want to use flow charts based on our real processes, based on our real work, and then we bring in and integrate requirements into our own business practices rather than the other way around. So that's kind of the beginning here. The whole idea of process approach really advocates that interpretation of requirements in your own business processes where they belong. So instead of writing a QMS along the clauses of the standard, as so many people do, let's turn that around and start with our own key business processes, plugging in requirements to the process where they belong. The current reputation of audit, especially an internal audit, seen as non-value added, it's a necessary evil. We're always complaining that our senior management do not see audits as a key source of information, again, of having any of that value. I work a lot with clients on internal audit, and I should say at the outset that really what I talk about here today is an internal audit approach, right? Because I do advocate for consulting and giving opinion, something a lot of CB auditors aren't doing. But really, if you're an auditor, an internal auditor especially, how can we bring that additional value? A lot of internal auditors are part-time, and it's always a nuisance to give them up to do an audit because leadership and their bosses in particular see the audits being asked of their employees as intruding on their real work. And of course, we know that audit findings can be seen as an inconvenience. And maybe that's because some of our findings are a little bit nitpicky. And as a result of that, our corrective action for findings not seen as a high priority. So what we have to do, and this is a slide I've had in my presentation for 20 years, we have to, as much as possible, design our QMS to be relevant, aligned with our reality, with our processes, and then we audit in the same way. We audit through that lens of a high level of understanding of our business and its processes. So again, we start with our own key business processes, flow charts, then roll in the requirements, building on what exists. I always encourage people to keep all the quality jargon and the ISO jargon to a minimum. Let's use language the way we use it in our organizations. And any auditor, I don't care in what capacity you perform an audit, you always have to be looking at adding value to your clients and use common sense. Sometimes we have findings that are of low level, not very strategic, and yes, maybe those need to be reported, but we got to dig a little deeper. We have to get past those easy audit findings like document control and things, and we've got to look a little deeper, trying to bring those findings that will add value to the organization. And I'm always telling my clients, the leadership, to demand better from their QMS, demand that QMS add value and drive the business. And of course, we know audits have a lot to do with bringing that value along with it. So this becomes the context for a risk-based approach, right? Auditing, I call it auditing beyond compliance and auditing for effectiveness, right? How do we align our audits with those things that are really important to our leadership? If we're auditing only around, let's say, the clauses of ISO 9000, we're not always getting at the most important areas of an organization. The scheduling process comes to mind. One of the most important things in a manufacturing environment is the scheduling process, scheduling the plant floor. Yet the standard itself is silent on that activity. There are no requirements in ISO around scheduling. However, we know how important it is. It ought to be rolled into our QMS and subsequently rolled into our audits too. So let's audit beyond compliance. Let's audit for effectiveness, right? Not only are you doing those things, but do they work? And are they what's best for us? Do they fit the context of our organization? Those are the things that are going to get leadership a little bit more excited about audits and see more value from all of us. The evolution of auditing, as you know, it went from kind of a compliance exercise to now auditors are being called upon to offer a total critique, a total evaluation of the business, focusing on best practices and focusing on risk. And it's essential when you're doing an audit, again, in any capacity, not just that you understand requirements, but you need a very high level understanding of the process, the business process that you're auditing. You're going to bring that extra dimension, and that knowledge will inform you around evaluation of risk and evaluation of effectiveness. So it's funny, the idea of risk as a basis for effectiveness has been obvious to me for a long time. But when the risk-based thinking came around 10 years ago, so many people got all bent out of shape, not understanding what it was all about. But at a basic level, right, how do you know where to impose control? Or maybe from an audit perspective, how would you know where to focus your audit energy if not on risk, right? How do I know I need an inspection? Well, it's all based on risk, right? How do I know I need higher levels of controls? It's all based on risk. And if you're preparing for an audit, you face that blank sheet. How do we know what to sample? How do we know what to focus upon or who to talk to? Well, let's let risk-based thinking, if you will, be our compass that sets us on that path to true north, to really get to an effective value-added audit. Risk provides that context. Again, using risk as the compass, it steers us into those areas that deserve more attention in an audit and maybe what areas deserve less attention in an audit. So risk then provides that audit strategy. And then not only do I believe this, but I've seen it, after many years working with clients in an internal audit capacity. When you bring the results of a risk-based audit to leadership, they're much more appreciative, right? It's almost like a three-dimensional audit where just auditing to ISO 9000 or other requirements is sort of a flat, two-dimensional approach. But once you start bringing that business knowledge, that process knowledge, and auditing with an eye towards risk, you're really bringing that extra depth. So a little bit on just flow charts. Again, this is just a quick example of a company flow chart. Every organization in the world that has ISO 9001 has a version of this flow chart that they built for clause 4.4. Again, keep it real. Don't use terms like, here is my process for product realization. What does that even mean? What do? You have order entry, you have purchasing, you have, setup, you have fabrication, you have shipping, right? You have real business processes with real names. Nobody in the world has a process in their business that's called product realization. So get away from that. So in this example, here is a typical business with all of its key business processes defined, again, a la 4.4. And there's often about 16 to 20, right? There's not 2 or 3. There's not customer-oriented processes and support-oriented processes. I don't even know what that means. I do this for a living. These are your processes. They're real. There's, again, almost about 16 or 20. You create a big flow chart like this. Everyone in the world has one. But then I want you to go a little bit further. Each of these boxes, each of these processes then can in turn be portrayed as a process flow chart. So if you're going to create a quality manual, and yes, you should create a quality manual, it's going to be a few pages long, and then it's going to have this in it, of course. But then create an Appendix A. Appendix A now is a set of 16 to 20, 22, however many, your process tells you how many. Your Appendix A now becomes a set of these flow charts. Flow charts are wonderful, right? They show us how work is actually done. You can lay in requirements and other things. I'm going to show you how to do that. A process flow chart like this can be a procedure, absolutely, and it becomes an audit checklist. Right? You almost just go top to bottom. Show me, show me, show me, show me. So I preface this discussion by saying As auditors, we ought to create a flow chart before we begin an audit, and we should always audit based on process rather than clauses. It would be great if process flow charts like this already existed in the quality manual, less work for us. Either way, if you want to do an audit, my posit to you is you ought to begin with a flow chart. If it doesn't already exist, you create one. Let's talk a little bit about process. When I teach auditors, I teach them to audit by process. Again, in the automotive industry where I work, IATF 6949, we are required to audit by process, and because it's just the best approach. So if I expect you to audit by process, and I do, it's only fair that we begin with the definition. This is the only definition in here, I promise you. I think this comes from ISO 9000 itself. A process is a set of interacting activities using resources, think flowchart, using inputs to deliver an output. So it's not a very long definition, but a key part of the definition of a process is there is an input and an output. So when we think about processes, they ought to have inputs and outputs. It's literally in the definition. So if we think about this list of processes, what we can do is we can test whether or not each of these things are processes by asking ourselves, is there an input and an output? And what is it? So if I'm doing the laundry, I could portray doing the laundry as a flow chart, a series of steps. What is the input? What is the output? Simply, dirty laundry becomes clean laundry. Soap and hot water are resources used in the process. In this definition, they're not inputs. The input to doing the laundry are dirty clothes. The output from the process is clean clothes. Soap, not an input. It's a resource used in the process. Barbecuing a steak, the same thing, right? We could make a flow chart for barbecuing a steak. The input is raw steak. The output is cooked steak. Seasoning, barbecue sauce might be an input, but propane or charcoal, not an input, a resource. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about inputs because I think a lot of people kind of conflate inputs with resources and with requirements. I'm going to continue to speak to that. I want to assemble a new toy. Again, we can portray that as a flow chart. I know it's a process because the input is a series of bits. The output is a fully assembled toy. Washing the car, the input is a dirty car. The output is a clean car. So what we're doing here is we are using this definition as a test of what is and maybe what isn't a process. Driving to work, buying groceries, those are a little less obvious. I'm gonna circle back to what the inputs to those might be. The input to buying groceries might be the need for groceries. Hold that thought. We're going to come back to it. But at least those first four are fairly obvious. I know that there's those first four on my slide are processes because they have a very clear and obvious input and output. So as auditors, you could audit any of these things. The other thing we can add to this definition, although it's not in my slide, processes are verbs, action words. Laundering or doing the laundry is a verb. Barbecuing, cooking is a verb. Assembling, washing, driving, buying, verbs. Teaching, lecturing, podcasting, if that's a word. Those are verbs, and those processes will have inputs and outputs. So like I just said, we use this idea of inputs and outputs to help us determine what is a process. Now, what is not a process? When I work with clients, I get that big flow chart that I showed you a few slides ago, and invariably somebody puts HR on the flow chart. They put quality assurance or IT on the flow chart. Nope. None of the things on this slide are processes. Human resources is not a process. There's no input, there's no output. Quality assurance, not a process. There's no input, there's no output. IT, tooling, management, what do those things even mean? Not processes. They're departments. HR is a department, quality assurance is a department. The others, I don't know what they are. A department like human resources could have processes within it. Training, hiring. Oh, those are verbs, aren't they? Quality assurance. A department can have processes inside of it. Calibration, calibrating, inspecting, corrective action, internal auditing, right? Processes inside of a department, those things are verbs. So I encourage you, when you model your QMS and when you audit your QMS, you don't audit these departments, you audit the processes. In HR, you might go to the HR department in order to conduct an audit of hiring, training, right? But nothing on this slide are processes. They're departments, they're nouns, tooling, management, environmental. Those aren't even departments. They're just nothing. So beware. And auditors, if you're auditing, maybe in the automotive industry, and your clients have claimed to identify processes per clause 4.4, and they have any of these on their list, give them a non-conformance. They don't understand what a process is. Typical business processes, right? At a high level, we all do these things. You know, we have a process for quotation and product design and purchasing and manufacturing and shipping. And then each of these orange boxes could be turned into, right, its own flow chart. We can have a flow chart for quotations and design and purchasing and manufacturing. And you know, we've heard of MOPS, COPS, and SOPs. I don't even know what that is. To me, you have processes for making stuff, like what's in orange on my slide there, and you have processes that support making stuff. Maintenance, hiring, corrective action, internal audit, calibration, right? So I don't know what MOPS are. They're just those MOPS or SOPs, okay? You make stuff and you support making stuff. I've never understood why we have that MOPS category, but anyway, what do I know? And notice how the output of one box becomes the input to the next. That's another key aspect of process. And as auditors, when we understand process and relationship, we also understand how breakdown or nonconformance or breakdown can occur, not just in each of these boxes, but in the arrows between the boxes. That is auditing for effectiveness. What else? The dual nature of input. So, of course, we talked about a dirty car becoming a clean car and a raw steak becoming a barbecued steak. But what about blood donation? I go to a blood donation clinic. Is blood donation a process? Yeah, it probably is. There's a series of steps. But what is the input? What is the output? I suppose the input could be Dennis with 8 pints of blood, and the output is Dennis with 7 pints of blood and a little bag of blood. Ew. Think of an input as a trigger. I got this idea from a computer, right? We literally talk about computer input. My computer sits here doing nothing until I press a button. Computer input. Computer input is a trigger. Now, with the blood donation clinic example I just gave, right, the input is I walk in. The input to the blood donation process is I walk in, and then everything starts, right? The person who walks in to give blood is the input, is the trigger to activate the whole process. So you have to think of inputs two ways. Yes, they are some raw material that gets converted into an output material. They're also triggers. So I want you to think about that. Purchasing, right? We trigger purchasing when inventory levels fall too low, or we give the purchasing agent a requisition, etc. So very important. Another thing is, and this is a more recent add to this presentation, requirements are requirements. Requirements are not inputs. There may be a rare case if the process happens to be write a design specification where, okay, one of the inputs is customers' requirements or regulatory requirements. But auditors and practitioners, be aware, requirements are not an input to a process. They are requirements, not the same thing. If I make a flow chart, I have an input, I have a series of steps in my flow chart, and there will be requirements associated with all the steps throughout the process, right? So we know what requirements are. They're not inputs. And when I see these kinds of things, it makes me crazy. So I hope you'll believe me, and I hope you'll adopt this definition for me. So we're going to prepare now for a risk-based audit. Let me show you my model. So we want to have a flow chart. We want to understand the process. We want to think about risks. We want to think about controls. And then after we create the flow chart with risks in it, then we can proceed into creating audit checklist questions that address not only requirements, but risks and how well those risks are controlled. So here's our working example. I'm going to drive to work. What's the input? What's the output? Well, the output is I get to work. The input is my alarm clock rings. Think about it. It's a trigger. The input to my going to work process is my alarm clock rings at 6 a.m., triggering me and beginning the process. So I created this little example. We get out of bed, we take a shower, we get dressed, we're driving to work, we drive through a drive-through, and yet we get our coffee. Here in Canada, it's Tim Hortons. We're always going to Tim Hortons drive-through. You know, in the United States, it's Dunkin' Donuts or it's Starbucks. In my going to work process, I have to include that step. I get through the drive-through, I get my coffee. So with a basic chart. Now I want to talk about enablers. We recognize that in every process, we're going to have these 5 M's. You recognize, of course, the fishbone diagram. You recognize the M's. Well, I think of these as aspects of a process, right? Every process is going to have some people and some materials and machines and methods and measurement, right? So the 5 M's are aspects of a process. And when I developed this model years ago, I just decided to call these enablers, right? These M's and the way we design our process and kind of a design around these M's really enable us to be successful. So I'm talking about the enablers that we put in place to make our processes successful, and they are the M's. In more recent years, I've been hearing the term controls, right? And maybe these M's are controls, and I think it's a reasonable term. So if you want to think about enablers to make a process successful, or you want to think about controls, to me, either term is okay. Enabler is just the term that I came up with. So let's think about this now. If I'm going to work, I'm going to have these enablers. I'm going to have the 5 M's. I have, you and me, the coffee server at the drive-through. I may have materials, the toiletries that I use when I'm, getting ready and I'm taking a shower and I'm shampooing my hair and I'm doing all the things. So we have materials that are consumed in the process. We have coffee consumed in the process. Clothing is a material, maybe a non-consumable material, but nonetheless. In this example, the machine might be the shower, the car I'm driving. We have methods, don't we? Everyone, and every one of you have a routine for getting ready every morning. And you have the route that you take when you drive to work or you get on a bus or a train, right? You have that routine. You have the route you take to work, really our method. And then measurement. When your alarm clock rings, the first thing you do is you look at your clock to say, okay, 6 a.m., I'm on time. We have a work in process measure. You're driving to work down the interstate. You're watching your speedometer. You're measuring your speed. You kind of know if you're on track or going to be late for work. And finally, you get to work. You look at the clock on the wall. I made it. So here's, in this example, I'm driving to work. I have all these enablers, all of these M's, if you will, associated with my process. Now all I do is I just drop in my enablers next to the step that they support. So if I'm getting out of bed, my enablers include an alarm clock, a desk lamp. If I'm taking a shower, right, the enablers include the shower itself, the soap and water. I'm getting dressed, I'm driving to work, right? All of these things I've listed on this slide are enablers. So really, they're all 5 of the M's together, again, just aligned with each step in the process that they support. If you're thinking about turtle diagrams, I hope you're not. It's not a great tool. You may recognize that the legs of the turtle include, how and what and who. And really, those 3 legs of the turtle are captured in the enablers column here. An important difference is, instead of them all just being lumped nebulously around a single circle, the turtle shell, instead of just the name of the process, we list all of the process steps, 6 to 8 steps, keep it high level, and then the who, what, how, aligned with each step in the process, much, much more clear. So enablers. Now we can think about risks, right? There are risks in every process, constraints, things that want to screw us up. And we now want to make sure we have appropriate controls in place or enablers in place to manage risk. And that's where we're going next. So if you think about it, all of the things in my enablers column are there by design. I decided what these enablers would be, didn't I? I decided what my alarm clock would be, or maybe it's my cellular phone. I decide what soap and shampoo I use. I decide what clothes I wear, right? I decide what route I take to work. So the enablers, we influence, we decide in process design what our enablers are. However, from a risk perspective, there's always these characteristic risks that we can't do anything about. They're characteristic risks. What we can do is try to put controls in place to respond to them. So my second bullet, I'm talking about characteristic risks, that they're just there and they can't change unless you do some fundamental, process re-engineering. The enablers then offset the risk. So if we think about it, if I'm driving to work, there are characteristics that just come along with that. Heavy traffic, hitting every red light, construction, bad weather, right? Car needs gas. We know what these are. As auditors, we can measure the extent to which we have considered these risks in our process and have put appropriate enablers and controls in place to offset. So that's where we're going next. Now, all you do, you build your flow chart. Here it is. You list your enablers, and then next to those, again, aligned with each step in the process, you have your risks. So the first step, my alarm clock rings. There's a risk that my alarm clock doesn't ring and I sleep in. We know that's a risk. Maybe that's your first audit question. What do you do if your alarm clock doesn't ring? I'm glad you asked. I have a 9-volt battery backup inside my clock radio. I'm 100 years old. I have a clock radio. But that's a pretty obvious question, isn't it? Oh, you have to get dressed. What if you don't have the right clothes? All the clothes you want to wear are in the laundry. What happens? Well, that doesn't matter because where I work, I don't wear a uniform. I can wear whatever I want. right? So the odds are I'm going to have some t-shirt and jeans I can wear to go to work. So not a big risk. I don't have any control. I don't need it. All right. You go to the drive-through at the coffee shop, there's always a risk of a big lineup. What do you do about that? Well, I have a decision box in my process. If there's more than 10 cars at the drive-through and it looks like I'm going to be, too long at the drive-through, too late for work, I skip that step. I go straight to work. Cool. Or think of it the other way. Do you have a control or enabler to offset the risk of a big long lineup at the coffee shop? Great audit question. The answer might be no, sir, I don't. So your follow-up is, well, how often do you get into a big long lineup and maybe that makes you late for work? Oh, all the time. All the time, eh? Maybe you have a finding. Not a very effective process if I follow the process, get in a big long lineup. The process by design makes me late for work once in a while. Insufficient enabler, insufficient risk mitigation. If your process design hasn't considered the risk of the coffee shop lineup is too long, right? If the lineup is more than 10 cars, pick a number, skip this step. Without something like that, you have an insufficient process design and you could call it a finding. Maybe not a non-conformance, but certainly an opportunity for improvement. And yes, auditors, when you see a weakness and you know a better way, you're morally obligated to bring it forward, unless you're a CB that have rules. Internal auditors don't. You have a moral obligation if you see an improvement opportunity to bring it. So there it is. We make a flow chart. We think about enablers that enable that step in the process to be successful. The M's, 5 M's, if you will, the fishbone. And then we think about risk. And now you see at the bottom, I have this measurable on time to work. ISO 9001 clause 4.4 says we want to have some criteria to measure the effectiveness of process. Stick it right in the flow chart. It's that easy. I know I have an effective process for driving to work if I get to work on time. Isn't that your measurable? Isn't that your objective? You know this process, you know the objective or the measurable. You're doing the audit now and you see something that gets in the way of you being to work on time, like getting stuck in a big long lineup. Write that up. Call it something. Maybe it's an NC, maybe it's an OFI, I don't care. Just get it in the report. Make sure that they know that you've identified this weakness in the process and it ought to be improved upon. So again, enablers, right? Things like the skill and experience of workers, definitely an enabler. Our procedures and methods, forms and checklists. I'm a big advocate for forms and checklists. Those are enablers. Computers and tools and equipment, supplier relationships can be an enabler. And then on the other hand, what are the risks? Changing customer needs, a lack of experience or skill in our workforce, common cause or even special cause process variation, a lack of standard work or not following the standard work. And then again, these characteristic risks of a process that just are baked in characteristically. You're driving to work, there's going to be traffic, there's going to be bad weather. What are you doing what have you done to plan your way around that? And then auditors, you're looking for that balance. If you have an area of high risk, you want an area for, you need high levels of control, big enablers, right? A little risk deserves a very little control or a very little enabler, right? So you're looking for that balance. On the left, maybe you have big risks and very little enablers. You would have an under-controlled situation. You could write that in your audit report. Evidence-based, of course. On the other hand, over-control. Right? You got all these enablers and controls in place, but the risk is small. What are you doing? It's waste. Over control. Now, granted, that's a very unusual situation, but it could happen. But certainly the situation on the left, I run to in every single audit I do. I see an area of risk. They haven't really thought of any kind of mitigation or contingency, so it becomes an OFI. Hey, you got this weakness in your process that you really might need to kind of shore up. And that is, auditors, how we consider risks in the process. We're giving you a tool to do it. And now you're asking questions based on risk and mitigation and drawing those conclusions on effectiveness based on how well our enablers mitigate risk. And then really this is the example. It's hard to see the flow chart, but it's a flow chart with process steps, enablers and risks, measurables in the corner. And then, oh yeah, responsibilities over on the left, right? The standard wants us to identify what, responsibility, authority, who does what. It's too easy to just drop in next to every step in the process flow chart who's doing it. Are you kidding? It's too easy. Flow chart, enablers and risks, who does what, measurables, there it is. And most processes can be portrayed on a single page. And then, like it says on the slide, once we have this flow chart with enablers and risks, we can create an audit checklist that includes questions around risk and how well our risks are mitigated and controlled. Yeah, I guess you don't have a handout. If you're interested in just seeing this example flow chart, my email address is at the end of this presentation. You could just ask me for it. The slide further back shows it, but it's still a little bit hard to read. One tip, if you create a flow chart like this for a QMS, and it would be processes like calibration, corrective action, right? Change control. If you create a flow chart like this at a QMS level, keep it high level. Just trust me. It can't be 30 steps long. Keep your process flow chart 6 steps, 8 steps, no more than that. Keep it at about a 5 to 10,000 foot level. So your flow chart, single page, usually 6 to 8 steps, and then enablers and risks as an ordered pair with each of the steps all the way down, all the way down. Now, you heard me say at the beginning of this presentation that requirements are not inputs. I said that because it's true. Requirements go in the enablers column. I don't know if that's actually in the slides, so it's a good thing you're listening. Requirements go in the enablers column against the step in the process where they belong. You might refer to an ISO 9000 clause. You should refer to your own SOPs, your own work instructions. A lot of these flowcharts stand alone. They are a procedure. If the process compels you to create a more detailed procedure or work instruction, great, go ahead and do it. Then just line it up in your process flow chart where it belongs against the step that it supports. All right, I think this is the last slide, but there's still more to do. Here we are 20 years later, 25 years later, I guess, and the process approach and process approach auditing not yet fully matured. I'm still running into companies that have, 1 to 20, 1 to 17. I guess it's 4 to 10, clauses now. Your QMS should be based on your own business practices. Internal audit still, and courses and internal auditing practices still focus too much on the standard, not enough on risk, not enough on critical thinking. Requirements still not being examined within the context of risk. I've found that abstract concepts such as the turtle diagram are counterintuitive to many people. Now, we can use a turtle because we do this for a living, but you try to train an internal auditor, you're going to spend half a day just teaching them what the turtle is. Flowcharts are much more intuitive. Another sad reality is that, a lot of our internal auditors, and it's not their fault, but they just lack that big picture thinking. They just lack that big picture understanding of their own organizations. But if you're in a professional auditing capacity, you don't have that problem. But do bring that expertise that you have in an industry. And that's how you're going to see beyond compliance. You're going to be auditing beyond compliance and getting much more effectiveness, bringing that additional value through opportunities for improvement to your client. Okay, well, thank you very much. There's my email address. There's my telephone number. If you want to talk about this or you want more information from me, please do reach out. This is what I do. If you'd like a copy of that flow chart that maybe you can read, I could email that to you. So please find me on LinkedIn, reach out. Let's have a conversation. Thank you very much again.
Well, thank you, Dennis DeVos. Great presentation. Really good overview of the auditing process with a risk-based focus, especially for internal auditors, all auditors, but internal auditors in particular. Really great job there, Dennis. So thank you for doing that. As Dennis mentioned, his email was just one slide back. So if you have questions for him, you can ask him via his email, or you can write us at info@exemplarglobal.org, and we'll get your questions right over to Dennis. Of course, claim your CPD for this session and all the other sessions here at the Expo. We do have a live event coming up at the end of the Expo, so be sure to tune in for that one as well, a live roundtable. So we look forward to seeing you all there. So thanks again, Dennis. Great job. Thank you all for being there, and we'll see you at the next session here at Exemplar Global's Online Expo. So long.